Welcome to our webinar this afternoon on state-level responses to labor trafficking. I'm Jane Anderson, and I'm a senior attorney advisor with Equitas. Equitas is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the criminal justice system's response to crimes of intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual assault, human trafficking, and related crimes. We are innovative in our approach, trying to help others sort of build sustainable and effective policy change that will improve these responses. We are trauma-informed and victim-centered, but also informed by the field and about the latest social sciences. I'm very proud that all of our resources are practical, geared at helping you immediately implement some promising practices. So as soon as you're done with this webinar, you should have a couple of new tools in your tool belt around building a state level response to trafficking, and leveraging those state agencies and governments to help you do that. Please think of Equitas as an ongoing resource. We have a lot of resources online or available upon request, whether that be a statutory compilation, research, articles about these types of crimes and innovative responses. We're also available for consultations. Since we're made up of mostly former prosecutors, I think this is our favorite thing to do, which is to maybe just serve as an extra soundboard for you. Maybe you're thinking about jury selection in a particularly challenging case and want to discuss strategies, or you're looking for an expert witness that can help you educate your judge and jury about the complex dynamics that might be involved in a case that you're working on. And we're available technically 24/7 for that. Best way to reach us is via email. But we also do a lot of training on all different scales. So national conferences, webinars such as this. We can also work with you and tailor any training for your jurisdiction or for your audience or for the topic you want to have some training brought in on. And we can do that either in person or virtually. And then we're proud to be involved in a lot of partnerships and initiatives. Everything from our Just Tech initiative, our partner with Spark, a lot of work on sort of online facilitation of violence, online sexual exploitation, those types of crimes. Also proud to be part of the Sexual Assault Kit initiative and our Just Exits initiative, which allows us to work with survivors of trafficking to inform and co-develop and co-deliver materials for you all. If you want to follow us in your professional capacity, please do so. We are often pushing out new training opportunities, new grant funding opportunities, and letting you know about upcoming events. Also, you can visit our website. Today, I am proud to have this presentation supported by the Office for Victims of Crime. And thanks to their support, we have developed this training, and we are continuing to develop other materials for the field on effectively prosecuting human trafficking. So the project is sort of about minimizing the harm to victims while maximizing offender accountability. And while they support our work, obviously what I say today is not necessarily representative of their official positions. So let's get started. So at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to better identify what sort of state agencies you might want to partner with to have that state level response. And so what state agencies maybe intersect with vulnerable populations, or and uh, which agencies intersect with labor markets or venues that might be considered high risk for trafficking. Looking at the role of the Office of the Attorney General in particular, those roles might differ from jurisdiction, but there's a sort of leadership role that can be leveraged in many different ways to build the profile of the work you're doing on labor trafficking and to ensure that the correct stakeholders are at the table. And then, of course, woven throughout this is going to be this idea of it takes collaboration to identify, to support the victims, and then to investigate and prosecution. and prosecute. You're going to need to figure out who are your partners. How can you best maybe collaborate with maybe some non-traditional partners that at a state level can really move your responses to labor trafficking to the next level. So when I talk about state level responses, we might be talking about a state level prosecution of labor trafficking. But there's a lot of things that we need to know about how our states are set up, or even how our offices of attorney general are set up. So we're going to look at several different ways that states can be involved on that level. So one of them is there criminal jurisdiction? They may have civil jurisdiction, which can be important when businesses are involved in the labor trafficking of individuals in a state. Collaboration, just the idea of cross-training so that everyone within a state, every state agency, all your stakeholders are trained to identify trafficking and to know, at least on an initial level, what to do when trafficking is identified or suspected. Um, State agencies can corroborate maybe a more traditional investigation because they may actually have evidence that supports labor trafficking. And we'll talk about what that might look like. Coalition building. So this is sort of on the same lines of collaboration, but building something maybe more formal in the sense of a coalition that brings in both government and non-government agencies, all dedicated to the mission of, reducing labor trafficking in your state. Convening power, maybe putting on a statewide training or a summit of those stakeholders to make sure that the sort of profile of labor trafficking remains in the public consciousness. Campaigns to educate the public, statewide billboards or brochures, or the ways that we talk about labor trafficking can really impact how we identify and investigate it. Oftentimes we see that sex trafficking gets most of the press. It's the thing that we hear about. Maybe we hear a little bit about labor trafficking on the side, but with the power and the sort of leadership of a state level response, we might be able to push campaigns to educate the public on the reality of all forms of all forms of trafficking, including labor trafficking. So one of the challenges that we have when we think about building a state level response is the fact that we've got 50 states, 5 territories, and a district all comprised in the United States, and they're all sort of different. So some of the things that are consistent about the Attorney General's role, and we'll be focused on sort of that role of the Attorney General's office. They are always the chief legal advisor to other parts of the state government. And they are typically also going to be the chief law enforcement officer. Now, that might look different in size, in jurisdiction, in organization, and even in the powers of the Attorney General's office. But those are two of the consistencies. And so we're going to spend most of our time really talking about the variations and what you need to do, what you need to know about your state. And it might seem sort of goes without saying, but it's surprisingly varied around the United States and a lot of nuances here. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do if you are looking at building out a state response or improving or refining a state's response to labor trafficking is get to know your Attorney General's office or AGO, or sometimes Office of the Attorney General. I sort of use those interchangeably. So these are the questions that you want to ask so that you are in a position to better understand how you can leverage, whether it be criminal jurisdiction, civil jurisdiction, or other powers of convening, collaboration, and cross-training. First, you've got to know the office that you're working with. So the question is, what is the criminal jurisdiction of your state attorney general's office? So in some states, there is no criminal jurisdiction. They cannot prosecute crimes of labor trafficking. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a lot of other things that they can do to build out that response. It just means that the actual prosecution of a labor trafficking case is probably not going to be led by your attorney general's office. In other jurisdictions, there's going to be original jurisdiction over all crimes, meaning that the attorney general's office can be the first investigation. They can charge, they can prosecute. An example of this is Delaware, where it is the only prosecutorial authority in the state of Delaware. So they're going to have original jurisdiction over every crime in that state. And there are other states that will have that provision as well. And then there's original jurisdiction over specific crimes. I would bet this is where a lot of us probably lie, or maybe that's just because that's how it was in Florida, where I was a local prosecutor and we had a statewide prosecution office run out of our attorney general's office. And they had original jurisdiction over crimes that were thought to be and sort of seemed like a natural fit for crimes that would cover a lot of different counties or that were really resource intensive, maybe. So, like Medicare fraud, mortgage fraud, and human trafficking. So they were enumerated within a statutory makeup of what crimes they had original jurisdiction over. You may have concurrent criminal jurisdiction with the local prosecutor's office. So the local prosecutor's office could prosecute, as could the state. And sometimes those are going to be, relationships that are built and that are well known, and sort of be like, okay, we know that if this kind of case comes to us at our local office, most likely the attorney general is going to sort of going to take it over, or we know that the attorney general has more resources to do these kinds of cases, but maybe we have sort of a prosecution review system where we sort of decide along with law enforcement and other partners, like who's going to prosecute this case. Many of us do that even within sort of local, state, and then federal prosecutors' offices as well. We might have some prearrangement or just understanding of who's going to take what cases under what circumstances, but there is legally concurrent jurisdiction. And then there might be limited criminal jurisdiction, where the attorney general's office could come in and either support a local prosecution, maybe sit second chair, and that could be upon the invitation of that local prosecutor's office, or the local prosecutor's office could sort of like give it to them, like, hey, will you do this? We don't have the resources or expertise to do it, maybe in particularly rural areas or things like that. Other times where an attorney general's office may have that limited criminal jurisdiction is when there's a conflict. Maybe the governor might ask the attorney general's office, can you step in and prosecute this because the victim was an elected official in that same county or something like that. So this is going to be the range of criminal jurisdiction questions. So ask you, do you know this about your attorney general's office? And then if not, this is something that I'd go and kind of try to find out about your attorney general's office. And then that helps you figure out some of the ways that you can partner for that. So criminal labor trafficking, again, 50 states, 5 territories, 1 district. They may have all very different labor trafficking statutes, but they generally follow the same sort of statutory analysis that we see here. And it's an easy way to look at any human trafficking statute, sex or labor, and kind of do your own analysis, is try to put your statute into these 3 elements. The first being, what are the prohibited acts? Right? It's prohibited to recruit, harbor, transport, provide, or benefit financially. And then the purpose is to recruit for forced labor, for forced services. You might have specific purposes of debt bondage or involuntary servitude. So you want to think about, what does that look like in your statute? How is that defined? And then the means of trafficking, which is really where, the rubber meets the road. This is where we're spending most of our efforts, seeing if we can build a case to prove that this trafficker recruited somebody for labor, but they did it using force, fraud, or coercion. Force, fraud, and coercion is how we typically talk about it. It is the language of the TVPA, which is a federal statute that defines who a victim is for purposes of services and legal immigration relief. but it is not a criminal statute. So you want to differentiate, make sure you know what your criminal statute looks like. And then one of the things we see when we look at state statutes of labor trafficking is that you might also have some enumerated or specified means of coercion, or your statute might define coercion in very clear terms instead of the federal definition, which is sort of this open bucket of it could mean a lot. It could be sort of any scheme, plan, or pattern designed to make someone do or continue to do what they're being asked. But you'll see in state statutes, it would be quite common to see like providing or withholding drugs. That's a enumerated means in a state statute, or confiscation of documentation or destruction of documentation. That might be enumerated within your statutes. And sometimes what's interesting to do is to look at your state or territorial definition of labor trafficking and compare it to the federal definition. And again, that's the federal criminal definition of labor trafficking. And you might find that your state statute is in some ways, and maybe with the right facts and circumstances, it might be a stronger statutory scheme to hold an offender accountable. So for example, in the federal criminal statute of forced labor, recruiting is not a prohibited act. So you might have a case where you've got a recruiter that you want to go after, and your state statute allows you to charge it as recruiting, but the federal statute wouldn't. So another good exercise for you if you're working in a coalition or a task force is just take some time to pull those statutes, and Equitas can absolutely help you. And then sort of walk through and say, okay, what are the differences? What are the potential advantages or disadvantages? Don't just look at like, what is the, potential sentencing. That's important, but you also want to look through some of these other nuances and think about that. And that's something we really love to help you out with. And when we send this webinar to you, we will also include a prosecution review tool that is a great sort of worksheet almost, where you can do that type of analysis as a team to figure out where is the best place to prosecute a particular case. So statewide prosecutions have some advantages. We know that labor trafficking is going to cross jurisdictions, so several counties or even various states, but this gives you a little bit more latitude of where you're charging it. And if you want to incorporate the fact that the trafficking happened in multiple counties, this could be an advantage. Depending on your state, it just may not be realistic to have every single local prosecutor's office have the capacity of having specialized prosecutors. These cases require specialized skill sets, specialized knowledge, right? So not every office can do that. So it might be more realistic to have a state level prosecutor, maybe in a role like a statewide resource prosecutor. A lot of states have resource prosecutors that help out with sexual violence cases, domestic violence cases, or intimate partner cases. You'll sometimes have state specialized prosecutors that do financial crimes or DUIs. But the idea of, is it more practical to have a state prosecutor who has experience and has the time and capacity to kind of build out an expertise that then can support local prosecutors, since not every county is going to have their own human trafficking prosecutor. These investigations, these prosecutions are incredibly resource intensive. And that's manpower, looking through maybe voluminous reports from digital evidence, so cell phone investigations, social media investigations, labor trafficking. You're going to want to follow the money. So, do you have specialized financial investigators? Do you have access to forensic accountants and software that they might need to do the type of investigation that can lead to a successful labor trafficking case? And then potentially also co-occurring like financial crimes, right? So you're not just looking at labor trafficking, but you're looking at the crimes that business, that organization committed all around, which might be tax evasion, money laundering, fraud and workman's compensation, wage theft. So those financial and organized crime approaches require specialized skill sets. The same person that is a really good trauma-informed interviewer of victims of domestic violence, that skill set of building rapport and being able to talk to victims with that trauma-informed approach, that's an incredibly important skill set to have. But someone looking through business and financial records, that can also support these cases in ways that allow for victims, for prosecution, even when victims aren't able to prosecute, to participate, but also to just hold that offender accountable for the full range of criminal activity they're engaging in, and just sort of lighten the load off of even participating victims. Like, it's not all on you. We have these other criminal activity, these other parts of our investigation that we have been able to do because we have these resources. And so the person, that's doing that amazing trauma-informed interview and the person that's looking at spreadsheets, that's often not the same person. But these cases, either take a jack of all trades approach with somebody becoming an expert in everything, or it involves sort of leveraging expertise that other agencies might have, that larger attorney general's offices may have access to. And so that's why statewide prosecutions can be really advantageous. And I want to give you an example of one out of California. And I encourage you to follow up and look at some of these citations that we have, just because there's so much more information. There's so much to say about each of these cases. And I'm using it as an example of how a state level criminal prosecution can be helpful. But there's so many other takeaways here as well. And this is a California case that involved residential care. In 2023, there was a trial where 3 members of this family were found guilty of 36 counts, and they were felony human trafficking and other labor-related crimes. And the California Attorney General's office had original criminal jurisdiction over this. So the Attorney General's office, or the Department of Justice of California, prosecuted this case. And so they had statewide jurisdiction. They prosecuted it because it was just a really involved case. Lots of victims. I think it went over at least 1 or 2 counties. But it was going to be really intensive for one office to handle. And so it made sense for the statewide prosecutorial authority to kind of take it over. Now, I will say one of the downsides of this, so I've had the privilege of speaking with the prosecutor who handled the case, and it was lengthy and it was in the middle of COVID and there were so many challenges, was that she said, well, when you're a statewide prosecutor, you never have home field advantage. And I thought, oh, that's probably pretty interesting to think about. So thinking about, even if the Attorney General or the Department of Justice is going to handle the prosecution in the courtroom, how can the local prosecutors still provide that support, whether it's that local victim support, right? Because the victims are in that county, or whether it's sort of being able to do a soft handoff to the Attorney General or give them some insight into how this courthouse works, because there's all these like nuances of this judge, this courthouse, right? Law on the books is one thing, but law in practice, we all learn as we, spend our time in one particular courthouse. We kind of get to know those things. And so state level prosecutors sometimes have that disadvantage. So how can we maybe close that gap by providing support from local prosecutors as well? So this case was, like I said, very involved. And so the actual exploitation, the time frame was about a decade, a 10-year time frame, where various family members trafficked dozens of employees through both residential care facilities, child care facilities, and also in the homes of the family members. They were targeting recent immigrants. The offenders and the victims were both from the Philippines, so there was a cultural understanding and some nuances that were pretty key to explaining this case to a judge and a jury. But no surprise, there were threats of deportation, threats of arrest. There were also false promises to assist with immigration, confiscation of documents. So all of that really related to who these victims were. But then we also have things like just deplorable working and living conditions, long hours, working basically 24/7 between the residential care facilities and the domestic servitude. and there was at least physical abuse against one documented victim in addition to all those other things. So that was a positive and successful example of how a state level prosecution was able to hold these offenders accountable on some level to the trafficking that occurred. So moving from the criminal jurisdiction, I also wanted to mention civil jurisdiction. Now, this is not my, level of expertise, and I wouldn't expect it to be many of yours either, but it's good to kind of know this, and I'll show you an example in a second. But civil jurisdiction could be they have no civil jurisdiction. It could be that they have civil jurisdiction when maybe the governor or some other authority grants them permission to investigate a business or some other sort of civil matter. And then the last one, of course, on the other side of the spectrum is Attorney General's office may have really broad discretion of opening investigations and conducting civil suits against individuals and companies that are violating labor law or state regulations. So here's an example out of Minnesota, and it was related to a dairy farm. So the Attorney General's office did eventually bring criminal charges in 2025. But sort of the instigation was that they originally had filed a civil suit against this dairy farm in 2024. So the original civil suit was about failure to pay wages and overtime, failure to keep the appropriate records, falsifying records, and there were some violations of sort of state habitability laws. So I would think that's sort of like housing, working conditions, those kinds of things. So this was the 2024 civil suit. And then in 2025, criminal charges were filed upon a referral from a county attorney. So the way that it's set up in Minnesota is that the county attorney, excuse me, let's say it the other way. Here's the quote here, is that upon request of the county attorney, the attorney general shall appear in court in such criminal cases as the attorney general deems proper. So this is a situation where the county attorney sort of had to ask the attorney general's office to take this on as a criminal case. And so again, I encourage you to sort of go back and look at some of the citations we've given here, because again, there's a lot of nuances. And if your state is sort of set up like Minnesota's, this might be an interesting sort of way to think about how you can leverage the civil power of your state, even though Minnesota doesn't have original criminal jurisdiction, because they were so effective in bringing out this civil case. Then that county attorney was like, well, that sounds like it should also be criminal charges. Why don't you go ahead and do that as well? And I might be making up how that conversation sounded, but you can imagine what that looked like. So the criminal charges include felony racketeering. So again, that's like an organized crime piece of it, and wage theft. And then the allegations are essentially these workers were overpaid and not overpaid. That's not how we usually see that happen. Overworked and underpaid. There were some threats to physical violence, and there were these dangerous working conditions where they didn't have these proper safety certifications. And so I always think about that last one is like, who would know that, right? Who is doing those types of inspections? Because it's not going to be law enforcement. That's not who's going to uncover these violations. These are going to be either victims that are reporting, not probably to law enforcement, they're probably reporting maybe to the Department of Labor or a victim service agency, or even something, Health and Human Services, OSHA, those types of things. So we think about like DOL and OSHA, they're federal agencies, EEOC. Those federal agencies have been part of the anti-labor trafficking movement for decades. And in fact, most of the early cases of trafficking were, for lack of a better word, they were prosecuted by the EEOC. So, but most states also have their own version of those organizations. So that's sort of the next step to ask yourself is what are our state agencies? Now, some of these state agencies might actually be under the Office of the Attorney General. So, for example, in Wisconsin, they have what they refer to as DCI, and that is a statewide law enforcement agency, and they are an arm of the Attorney General's office, and they have statewide powers to investigate cases. Now, they have limited power too, about similar to prosecution, about, kind of being able to investigate something upon request of a local agency. They support local agencies in their own jurisdictions, but they have that, and they are directly related to Attorney General's office. So good to know whether there is such a investigatory agency in your state, or if it's a completely independent agency like the the state police. They're not related to the Attorney General's office as far as like they don't report to them. Attorney General's office can't tell them what to do, but they probably work very collaboratively together, right? So how does that work? What is that relationship like? So obviously, traditional partners are going to be your statewide law enforcement agencies. The other thing I'd say is that every state also has their own version of Department of Labor. It might be called the Department of Labor, your state's Department of Labor. We've also seen a lot of these departments are going to be called something like the Department of Workforce Development. And they're going to have very similar rules. And one of the things that, let's say, the Department of Workforce Development have is that they work hand in hand with the federal Department of Labor, and they assist with like inspections and reporting of complaints and things like that related to seasonal workers that come into the United States on a temporary work visa, like an H-2A visa or an H-2B visa. Those are probably going to be the most common that you'll see. H-2A is specific to agriculture. H-2B is more broad than that, but it's seasonal work that an employer is asking the federal government for permission to bring in these seasonal workers because they've already shown that they cannot hire within their local community U.S. citizens. So they say, federal government, we would like permission to have this number of visas so that we can bring in this workforce for, let's say, a season of picking apples. Well, to get permission, there's usually some initial inspection where someone's gonna go out and look at the housing that employer promises to provide to the workers. They're going to review all of the paperwork that's submitted. It's public-facing paperwork that includes things like how much are you going to pay them? What is the actual job that you're going to ask them to do? How are they going to have access to food? Are you supplying it? Are they going to have more independent living conditions? Are you supplying the housing? Are you putting them in touch with this? Is the rent and food, is that being taken out of their paycheck or not? And the state departments of labor and workforce development are the ones that liaison between the local employers and the federal government. And then they're going to, based on their own internal policies, figure out, okay, we're going to do an inspection, or we're going to go to this workplace, and they have permission to just walk onto the workplace and sort of ask questions, look at paperwork, kind of do this. I'm sure the word is not inspection, might be something else, but they're allowed to have their eyes and ears on these workplaces because the employer has agreed to that when they applied to get these workers to come into their state and do this work. So if you think about who has eyes and ears on vulnerable populations or high-risk labor markets, your Department of Labor, your state Department of Labor is really going to be key in this. Now, the other thing to know is, what is the scope of that agency? Like, what is the purpose of the Department of Labor and Workforce Development? Some of it's going to be enforcement, right? There's going to be violations, there's going to be fines, but at the end of the day, they are not a law enforcement agency in the sense that they're looking to prosecute people. They're really looking to make sure that worker has their rights upheld and that the employer is doing everything the employer promises to do. So they're more about compliance than necessarily like enforcement and prosecution. So if they're a partner of yours, it's important to say, okay, what is the scope of your work? What is the mission of your work? What is the goal of what you're doing? And then figuring out, how do we intersect? How can we work together? Knowing that we have slightly different sort of roles and responsibilities, but we all are looking towards, we don't want workers to be exploited in our communities. So then the next one I have here is the State Revenue Service or Tax Board. This is your state, like IRS. So like I said, if businesses are involved in labor trafficking, they're probably involved in other criminal activity, right? All maybe interrelated, but I'm guessing they're not paying their taxes. I mean, they're definitely not paying their like employment taxes. They're probably not paying the right amount of what they should for unemployment insurance. And there's all of these other sort of business type violations. And if they're not paying their taxes, maybe that's where the state really can be like, wait, we have a stake in this because we're losing money because we're not getting our taxes from these businesses that are operating and exploiting people within our state. So these could be really great partners in identifying and filing additional charges that could be criminal. But also they're going to have a lot of your evidence that you need of, okay, they're only reporting income of this, but I can prove otherwise that they've actually earned this much money. So now we have a money laundering charge. Or, hey, they're saying they only have 10 employees, but we can observe that they have 30 employees. They're not paying the unemployment insurance at the rate that they should, or they're not reporting correctly. So that's another partner. Consumer protection. This is one that I don't think we easily think about, but maybe it's like a Better Business Bureau, something like consumer protection. These are entities that really are very skilled at investigating businesses. And they're going to have skill sets that your law enforcement probably won't have, as far as like, how do you look at business records in combination with all of these other maybe complaints or violations that are coming in through the public or through other businesses or through things like labor unions. So there is a case out of Hennepin County, which is um, Minneapolis area, and it came through a report to the Consumer Protection Board there, and it was a labor union sort of saying, hey, this business must be in violation of something. And again, I'm don't get my facts exactly correct, but essentially, this labor union, because they are experts in what construction business is supposed to look like, um, they're like, this business has to be exploiting their workers because there's no other way that they could be doing this at the cost that they're either pitching or that they're bidding on these projects with. And so through that, yes, the labor union had a self-interest in reporting this for sure, but it also did uncover labor trafficking in this construction business. And so the Consumer Protection Board worked with the local prosecutors, and the case was charged under the state statute for labor trafficking in Minnesota. And the offender pled guilty to those charges. And it came through a state agency that got that initial tip. Licensing boards. So that's is another place where we just need to kind of educate ourselves and what kinds of businesses need licenses and what kind of licenses do they need. So we think about, a hair salon, a nail salon, they're going to need to be licensed. Their workers are also going to be licensed. And what kind of oversight is involved? What kind of paperwork is involved? Who is in charge of like making sure people are compliant with those licensing requirements? Liquor licenses, licenses to sell cigarettes. Often liquor licenses, when you sign up to get a liquor license, you agree to these sort of spot inspections where folks from, whether it be your ABC or your version of that, can come in and at any time ask to see that business's books, their surveillance videos, all sorts of records. And if that business is selling alcohol, but also trafficking people in the kitchen, this is gonna be a really great partner for you to understand. There might be tons of records. They might also be, because they get eyes and ears into businesses that are at risk, they might also be the first ones to identify trafficking, or at least like sort of have a tip to follow for others to follow up on. So those are sort of ones that I think intersect with the at-risk businesses. And the last two are more about like who's going to be interacting with our vulnerable populations. So Health and Human Services, your child welfare agencies. I'd also say your Department of Education, thinking about, are we educating our schools, our administrators, our teachers? Several labor trafficking cases have come out of teachers and school officials recognizing either child labor of their students who are tired, not showing up, things like that, or kids are reporting about their parents working these crazy hours and why their parents aren't home at night because they're working, triple shifts and things like that. So your Health and Human Services, your child welfare agencies. So that again, it might be the children that are being exploited through labor trafficking, but it also could be the child welfare agency is being involved because there's an allegation of neglect, and that neglect might actually be a result of the parents trafficking. So I think we always think about these agencies identifying child victims. We don't necessarily think of them as also being able to identify parents that are being exploited, and therefore it's showing up as a child being neglected. So along with these agencies, the other question to ask, and the answers might be here, but the questions to ask is, who might receive an environmental complaint? So we've had some labor trafficking cases and investigations out of like um, forced labor within the illicit cannabis industry. Well, not only are they growing black market cannabis, but they are also using illegal pesticides that are causing environmental impacts that are quite severe and serious. And so cases might come in as environmental complaints because a river is being polluted. We've seen like trail cams that are showing animals get into the pesticides and sort of dying or collapsing as a result of that poisoning from that. So it might come in that way. Is that going to be your state Department of Natural Resources, your Fish and Wildlife, right? Those are additional state agencies that might have eyes and ears there. Who's receiving your wage complaints? So wage theft, a lot of labor trafficking victims aren't going to self-identify as having been a trafficking victim. Um, Labor trafficking victims are about 50, a little bit over 50% are male victims, adult victims, here trying to maybe support a family. And they are less likely to be like, I'm a victim of labor trafficking. They might say, like, I was tricked, or it wasn't what I was promised, or it wasn't what I was told. But you're most likely to have maybe tips come in sounding more like, I'm not getting paid what I was told. This is wage theft. And then if you scratch and you dig a little bit deeper, you may end up finding more indicia of trafficking beyond just the not being paid what they were told. And so where are those reports going in? And does the person receiving that report have, sort of access to some services for that victim? But also, do they have the training to identify, hey, there might be something more here. Let's take a deeper look at what the allegation is. Licensing violations, safety violations of workplace safety, because we've already seen a couple of cases where that's maybe been the complaint. And so we've got to look at that, and we automatically also think, okay, do we have partners that we can convene that have within our medical community? Because sometimes it's going to be a workplace safety complaint. There's been a workplace injury, and the trafficking is really the fact that they weren't allowed to receive medical attention. Maybe we find that out later. But sometimes the workplace injuries can be so severe that the victim will have been brought for some level of medical attention, probably at an urgent care, someone where there's not as, formal of paperwork going on or something. And then they can do that. And so are those folks also being trained to identify it? I think the studies range, and I'm not sure if they're specific to sex or labor trafficking or not specific, but the numbers that we hear, and even from those with lived experience, most report that they had some intersection with the medical community at some point in their trafficking, and that it was not identified. So maybe not necessarily a state agency, but thinking about what state agencies are going to know about workplace injuries, and then also bringing that, just even expanding it beyond that. So once we kind of figure out who these are, and in fact, um, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is just every state has like a state um, agency website. So if you Google New Jersey State Agency, I haven't checked all 50 states, 5 territories, and 1 district, but the states that I have checked all have some version of this. And it basically just lists every state agency of New Jersey as an example. And I would just go down that list and think to yourself, well, first off, try to figure out what that state agency does, some sort of general concept of what they do, and think to yourself, where might their role be in a state response to labor trafficking? Do they have an intersection with businesses or with people, with other systems, with are they doing intake on some level of these complaints or reports? So work your way down that list of state agencies. And I'm going to guess you can probably find an intersection or potential intersection with labor trafficking in every agency. So then it's like, okay, well, what do we do when we identify, hey, nobody has been talking to the, consumer fraud division. What do we do? Well, we've got to identify who those people are, maybe figure out, does that state agency have a human trafficking point person? Sometimes that's all that you need to start doing this work is say, okay, this agency, you need a human trafficking point person. That's the person that's going to get the emails about the coalition meetings. That's the person that's going to get opportunities for training. That's the person that if somebody wants to call about a tip, that's who it goes to, right? So sometimes it's just as easy as that. Now, of course, that point person should have some specialized knowledge. It doesn't have to be they're an expert in human trafficking, but some specialized knowledge about the reality of trafficking, the reality of labor trafficking, what it might look like in your state. So if you've done some sort of like, pseudo threat assessment of here are some industries we've identified, or here are some cases that were worked on, right? So, those folks have some specialized level of training. So if that agency is like a place where they might identify trafficking, then they should have cross training, what it's going to look like, how it might come to them, might be some, red flags or indicators. And then the next question is, what do they do with that information? Okay, what's the referral mechanism? Are you referring to another state agency? Are you referring to a law enforcement? What is that next step? And these are pretty easy things to implement on a state level. As far as when I say easy, it's like I'm not asking people to do like heavy lifts. Now, coordinating it, making it all happen, that's never easy. But we're not asking that every single person in your state government has this high level of training, but you can sort of triage when you are doing this sort of state level analysis. Now, you might also, some of these state agencies might have the power to investigate on some level, right? It might be investigating crimes other than human trafficking, or it might be investigating, a complaint or something like that. But then the idea is, okay, what kind of jurisdiction does that agency have? And if they're not the ones that are really investigatory, what kind of corroboration might they have in their records, right? Do they have, oh, these were the last 7 inspections that was done at this business, or here's a collection of all the complaints we've received on this business. And then that kind of data can really drive data-driven responses, right? You start overlaying some of this data of like what businesses are bringing in workers, what businesses have a lot of complaints, and then what businesses keep changing ownership through your Secretary of State will know about, corporate records. And then all of that can be overlaid and you can start doing some data-driven work as well. So the types of potential evidence, as I've mentioned, you've got your tax records, your business records, licensing, inspection, records of complaints, also ownership records. That's what I refer to as the Secretary of State. Most of the time, if you're going to incorporate or you're going to be a business, you've got to, file those records with the Secretary of State or some version of that. That might have, who is the managing officer. A lot of times there's fees involved, who paid those fees. You might have state utility companies that have records of this. And so these are all things that maybe there was another investigation, an internal investigation, like your version of the Office of Inspector General that does that sort of internal investigations. All of this might be relevant. Okay, so I want to give another example of how this might look on a state level. So this is a Massachusetts case. It was prosecuted by the Attorney General's office and involved a cleaning crew. And it was a state agency referral, and actually they worked hand in hand. So in 2023, they secured a conviction for labor trafficking, assault, and wage theft. And the case was sort of co-investigated by the Attorney General's office's Fair Labor Division and their human trafficking division through the criminal side of things. And so that's another sort of potential promising practice is, do you have something statewide that's going to be investigating, so what they call worker justice rights or fair labor division? And those cases might just be, again, might be the wage theft cases, but then they might turn into something else, and being prepared for that, because a lot of times that's how it happens. And so in this case, they secured a conviction, state level labor trafficking case prosecuted by the Attorney General's office in conjunction, those two divisions. And the defendant forced two women to work for a janitorial and maintenance company, happened between 2016 and 18. And again, unpaid or underpaid work, no overtime, no benefits. So those are the things that are coming through the Fair Labor Division, right? And then what comes to is like, oh, okay, now where does it become trafficking? Now we're talking about forced to complete additional household chores that were not even in the job, threatening, holding the passport, threatening deportation, abuse of the legal system, and the physical assault. All of a sudden, now we're talking about trafficking, and it's going to move from what maybe originally came in as a fair labor issue into a trafficking issue. But the fair labor people, they have all that expertise related to some of those crimes that we want to make sure we're also charging, so that the judge and the jury can see a complete picture of the exploitation and trafficking that the offenders are going through. Okay, so the other thing that can be important on state level, so even if you don't have criminal jurisdiction or even civil jurisdiction, you still have this sort of leadership role of your state agencies, and you can leverage that leadership role, or you can be a part of task forces, coalitions. And those, again, it can be on varying levels. So, this training is supported by the Office for Victims of Crime, or OVC. OVC also funds what are called enhanced collaborative model task forces to combat human trafficking. Sometimes we refer to these as ECMs, or ECM task forces. And the idea of these OVC-funded ECM task forces are that, and it's really innovative and cool, and if you're interested, I encourage you to kind of look out for opportunities, is that they are co-led, which means that two entities apply for this together. One is a law enforcement entity, and one is a victim service entity. And they apply together, and they co-lead this task force. And that's why we call it the Enhanced Collaborative Model Human Trafficking Task Force. And there are, at any given time, about 40 to 50 of these funded task forces across the country. And they are different categories. And over the years, it's sort of changed, and it looks a little bit different year to year. But recently, they have had what they call the statewide version of this. So you can apply for this as a statewide task force. And it's based on the recognition over years that state level responses have certain advantages for sure, but there are also sometimes some specific challenges, and a lot of that's geography and trying to get all the people together, and depending on the size of the state, and the sort of the amount of like rural areas that might exist. So it's just acknowledging that statewide task forces have specific challenges and really specific advantages as well. And so there are several states right now that are members of their state-funded ECM or OVC-funded ECMs, and it's a great way to build that state-level response. There are also a lot of folks that are involved in FBI human trafficking task forces. I think in recent years, I feel like the primary focus of that is child exploitation and child sexual, what is it? So CSEC, some ICAC references, but those are really great ways to start building up capacity on different levels. You might have federal partnerships where you've got state agents that are also task force officers with federal agents. So again, just leveraging the partnerships and the resources and the scope of our work. And then there might also be interstate partnerships if you're working in, in a region where that traffickers are sort of making a loop, or that, that they might just cross state lines too. It might be helpful for you to have interstate partnerships. And of course, that's going to be helpful if we've got state entities on both sides of those partnerships working together and at that same level. So we'll give our sort of last example of this is Utah. And Utah is an ECM task force. They are part of that. So the funding from the Office for Victims of Crime supports a statewide task force, and it's co-led by the Utah Attorney General's office. The Utah Attorney General's office has a prosecutorial arm, and they also have a statewide investigatory arm as well. So they are co-located, and it's quite a there's been some real positive outputs of being co-located within that state agency. They also have state systems-based victim advocacy, and they are able to work really easily together because they're sharing office space. They're chatting in the hallways. They're, always being able to sort of bounce ideas off of one another. But they are actually co-leads along with a community-based organization as well. But because it was led by this Utah Attorney General's office, one of the advantages is that the Utah Attorney General's office is not responsible for responding to 911 calls, right? That they're not a responsive agency like our local police and sheriff's office might be, right? And when you're constantly being responding to calls, it's a lot harder to make like intentional proactive plans. But they had the privilege of having some time and being able to be kind of strategic because they were this statewide agency. They had the special funding, and they really thought, we're going to focus on Utah. We're going to kind of take an inventory. Where do we think trafficking might happen in Utah? How might it be happening in Utah? Sort of that same sort of threat assessment that I've been talking about as we've gone through things. And what they determined was that there were some high-risk neighborhoods, whether it was the level of crime or the victim population there. They said, okay, let's do some focused investigative efforts in this community. And what they did, and collectively together, they kind of came up with this plan. And so between 2013 and 14, the attorney generals, those investigators really were proactive about building relationships within this particular community. So they were able to come up with a tailored plan, a strategic plan based on probably data and anecdotal information about this particular community. And so the statewide response included this proactive effort to build community relations within this community. A lot of the investigators came back from maybe narcotics backgrounds, and they're like, you know what, we're good at building confidential informants, building people in the community that we can count on as eyes and ears and get information from. So that's what they did. And as a result of one of the tips from a community member, it turned into an extensive investigation, eventually charged and prosecuted as forced criminality, labor trafficking, as well as sexual assault. Um, if you if you've been to Equitas trainings, you probably heard me talk about it. I've had the privilege of working with the lead investigator on the case and others in Utah to have a little bit of an insight into what is the Victor Rax case, is how we term it. Equitas also hosts a written resource and a webinar. I co-present with the lead investigator, amazing agent called Josh Kalas, and talking about this case. And I don't want to go into the details, but because the point of this example really is to show that that statewide task force gave the opportunity to folks to be proactive, thoughtful, data-driven, and eventually identify a very serious case where they eventually did charge this offender with labor trafficking through forced criminality, as well as all these sexual assault crimes as well. The investigators, the prosecutors, the victim services were co-located at the Attorney General's office, huge advantage. And then they wanted to partner, and that's one of the points of the ECM is they also want to be partnering with community advocates because that's so important to victims to also have that relationship with a community-based victim advocacy where they have a confidential relationship and they have access to additional services. And so that partner is part of the ECM as well. And as a result of this, 30 plus victims were identified and provided services. So that's just another example of how a state can tackle labor trafficking in an intentional way. So we've talked about lots of different examples of how this can work and really specific strategies of identifying who these stakeholders are and how attorney generals can be involved in their offices. But really want to kind of finish off with like, even if none of this is going to happen, the advantage of having sort of this attorney general that has this leadership of an entire state that can be leveraged as well in smaller ways, or not even smaller ways, just in different ways, I guess. They can prioritize issues. What are they talking about? What are they sending out press releases about? Who are they partnering with on the level of sort of convening stakeholders? Are you when we do a statewide, we're hosting an event and it's the statewide event, maybe a human trafficking summit. Who can determine that, we're going to prioritize labor trafficking this year. We're going to carve out specific time and that's all we're going to talk about, labor trafficking. That can be the leverage of that leadership and that prioritization of issues can lead to getting the right stakeholders at the table, maybe some of those non-traditional partners, maybe those other state agencies that don't necessarily think of themselves as having that much of a role, and all of a sudden identifying that they do, hosting an event, maybe collaborating on educational campaigns or public service announcements and getting it out there that labor trafficking in our communities is not acceptable. And that labor traffickers are identifying and exploiting the most vulnerable within our communities, thinking they're going to get away with it because we don't have a robust response, because we don't have enough eyes and ears out there to identify labor trafficking when there isn't this otherwise natural intersection with law enforcement. We need to be partnering and we need to be leveraging everyone involved to do this right. So moving forward, first off, just get to know your attorney general's office. Even if you're working with an attorney general's office, maybe the mission is to get to know all the other state agencies and figure out how to collaborate with them and figure out what might their role be, what might their intersection be, and then leveraging that leadership role to prioritize labor trafficking as a topic and to build that statewide response. So thank you very much. For more information, the Office for Victims of Crime, they have a training and technical assistance center. They have some specific trafficking resources. Please make sure you take a look at those. Again, I'm Jane Anderson. I'm an ongoing resource to you along with my colleagues at Equitas. Please check out our website. Think of us if you've got upcoming training events where you want to highlight labor trafficking, or maybe you want to figure out how to build up such a coalition of stakeholders in your community to think about labor trafficking more, maybe more effectively identify, investigate, and prosecute it, while at the same time making sure victims are served in appropriate ways. You can reach out to us directly. We also host office hours the third Thursday of every month. You can register for those on our website with all the rest of our trainings. Want to encourage you guys to check that out. Every month, it's sort of a different topic. Some of them are trafficking, stalking, sexual violence. We cover everything, but usually we'll bring in some outside experts, and it's really an opportunity for you all to talk about your cases and to talk with others across the country that are working on similar issues that you're working on. One last plug while I talk about trainings is that Equitas is proud to be putting together some national trainings on human trafficking. So in November, we'll be doing a leadership institute, and that's for sort of executive level police and prosecutors. And it's really about how to set up your agency for success, not so much about the nitty gritty of investigating these cases, but thinking more from that organizational structure and how to do that. That will be November 13th and 14th in Washington, D.C. And then in December, the week of December 8th or 9th, whatever that week is, it's the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They'll be in Tucson, Arizona. That one's currently pending OVC approval. But if you sign up for our trainings, if you check out our website, you will get notice of all of those when we start marketing. But otherwise, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for your interest in this topic, and be safe.